Chapter 12 of the Boy Scouts Book of Campfire Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by DavidG. The Boy Scouts Book of Campfire Stories. Chapter 12, The Story That the Keg Told Me, by Adirondack Murray, more formally known as William Henry Harrison Murray. Editor's Note: the author is Adirondack Murray because he, more than any other man, rediscovered for the past and present generation the wonderful Adirondack woods. We are grateful to Mr. Archibald Rutledge for having shortened the story, and to Mr. Murray's publishers, DeWolf and Fisk Company, for permission to print it in the abbreviated form. The Editor. It was near the close of a sultry day in midsummer which I had spent in exploring a part of the shoreline of the lake where I was camping, and, wearied with the trip I had made, I was returning toward the camp. The lake was a very secluded sheet of water hidden away between the mountains, not marked on the map, whose very existence was unsuspected by me until I had a few days before accidentally stumbled upon it. Indeed, in all the world, there is hardly another sheet of water so likely to escape the eye, not only of the tourist and of the sportsman, but also of the hunter and the trapper. Day by day, as I paddled over the lake or explored its shores, the conviction grew upon me that the place had never before been visited by any human being. The more I examined and explored, the more this belief grew upon me. The thought was ever with me. But on this afternoon, as I was paddling leisurely along, my paddle struck some curious object in the water. I reached down and lifted it into the boat. It was a keg. Amazed, I sat looking at this proof that my lake was not so unknown as I had supposed it to be. Where had it come from? How did it get here? Who brought it, and for what purpose? These and similar questions I put to myself as I paddled onward toward my camp. After having built my campfire, I seated myself with my back against a pine. It was then that my gaze fell on the keg, which I had brought up from the boat and had set on the ground across the fire from me. I sat wondering where it had come from, and what had become of him who must once have handled it. It may be that I was awake, it may be that I was asleep, but as I was thus looking steadily and curiously at the keg, it seemed to change its appearance. It was no longer a keg, it was a man. A queer little man he was, with strange little legs, and the funniest little body, and the tiniest little face. Then, standing bolt upright and looking at me with eyes that glistened like black beads, the miraculous keg man opened his mouth and began to talk. "I desire to tell you my story," it said, "the story of the man who brought me here, why he did it, and what became of him, how he lived and died. The earliest remembrance I have of myself is of the cooper's shop where I was made. Although I look worn now, I can recall the time when all my staves were smooth and clean, so that the oak grain showed clearly from the top to the bottom of me, and my steel hoops were strong and bright. The cooper made me on his honor, and took a deal of honest pride in putting me together, as every workman should in doing his work. I remember that when I was finished, and the cooper had sanded me off and oiled me, he set me up on a bench and said to his apprentice boy, 'There, that keg will last till the judgment day, and well on toward night at that.' I wondered at that. One day a few weeks later a man came into the shop and said, 'Have you a good strong keg for sale?' He put the question in such a half spiteful, half suspicious way that I eyed him curiously, and a very peculiar man I saw. He was not more than 40 years old, of good height and strongly built. He was a gentleman, evidently, although his face was darkly tanned, and his clothes were old and threadbare. His mouth was small. His lips were thin and had a look of being drawn tightly over his teeth. His chin was long, his jaws large and strong. His hair was thin and brown. But the remarkable feature of his face was his eyes. They were blue-gray in color, small, and deeply set under his arching eyebrows. How hard and steel-like they were, and restless as a rat's! And what an intense look of suspicion there was in them, a half-scared, defiant look, as if their owner felt every one to be his enemy. Ah, what eyes they were! I came to know them well afterward, and to know what the wild, strange light in them meant. But of that by and by. "Have you a good strong keg for sale?" he shouted to my master, who turned around and looked squarely at the questioner. "Yes, I have, Mr. Roberts. Do you want one?" "Yes," returned the other, "but I want a strong one. Strong, do you hear?" "Here's a keg," said my master, tapping me with his mallet, "that I made with my own hands from the very best stuff. It will last as long as steel and white oak staves will last." The price was paid with a muttered protest, and Roberts hoisted me under his arm and bore me from the shop. As we hurried along, I noticed that my new master spoke to no one, and that people looked at him coldly or wonderingly. At last we came to a common-looking house set back from the road, with a very high fence built around it and a heavy padlock on the front gate. There were great strong wooden shutters at every window. My master entered the house and set me down on the floor, then went to the door and locked it, drawing 2 large iron bars across it. He went to every window to see if it was fastened. Carrying a candle in one hand and a great bludgeon in the other, he examined every room, every closet, the attic, and the cellar. After this he came back to me, set me on a table, started one of my hoops, and took out one of my heads. From a cupboard he got a large sheepskin, and with a pair of shears fitted me with a lining of it. I must say that he did it with cleverness, and he seemed well pleased with his work. When he had done all this, he brought his bludgeon and laid it on the table beside me. Also he laid there a large knife. Then he went to the chimney and brought an ash pail which was full of ashes. From the cupboard he brought an earthen jar. From under the bed he fetched a bag. From the cellar he returned with a sack, all damp and mouldy. When he had all these side by side near the table, he sat down. Then out of the ash pail he took a small pot, and having carefully blown the ashes off, he turned it bottom upward on the table, and what do you think was in it? Gold coins, some red and some yellow, but all gold. He emptied each of the other receptacles, and out there flowed heaps of gold coins almost without number. How they gleamed and glistened! How they clinked and jingled! And how the deep and narrow eyes of my master glittered, but how the lips drew apart in a wide smile! It was a fearful sight to see him playing with the gold and to hear him laugh over his treasure. It was dreadful to think that a human soul could love money so. And he did love it, madly, with all the strength of his nature. He would take up a coin and look at it as a father might look upon the face of a favorite child. Ah me, 'twas dreadful. He would take up a piece and say to it, "Thou art better to me than a wife," and to another, Thou art dearer than father or mother. Ah, such blasphemy as I heard that night! How the sweet and blessed things of human life were derided, and the things that are divine and holy sneered at! At length he fell to counting his gold, and for a long, long time he counted until his hand shook and his eyes gleamed as if he were mad. When he had counted it all, he jumped from his seat, shouting like a maniac, $16,666! Again and again he shouted this in wild triumph. After a while he sobered down, and in sight of me he began to pack away his treasures, carefully, caressingly, as a mother might lay her children to sleep. When I was full to the brim with shining gold, he put my head on, fitted the upper hoop on snugly, and then put me in the bed. The great knife he slipped under the pillow. Then, blowing out the light, he lay down beside me with one arm thrown about me. So the miser, clasping me to his heart, fell asleep. Day after day, night after night, this self-same performance was repeated. My master did little work. Indeed, he did not seem eager to increase his store, but merely to hold it safely. But about this he was so anxious that he was in a fever of excitement all the time. For days he would not leave the house. Never was he free from the fear of losing his money. And this suspicion had poisoned his whole life, had made him hate his kind, and lose all belief in the love and the goodness of God that he once professed. One day in summer he left the front door open. I was drowsing, when suddenly I heard him give a frightened yell. In the doorway stood a man and a woman. The man was the village pastor, and the woman, I soon learned, was my master's wife. For a moment my master stood looking angrily at them. Then he said abruptly, "Why did you come here?" "John," said the woman, "your child Mary is dying, and I thought that you, her father, would want to see her before she passed away." Her voice choked, and her breast heaved with sobs. "Dying, is she?" said my master brutally. "I don't believe it. You are simply after my gold. You might as well get away from here," he added with a threatening look. "John," returned the woman, great tears coming to her eyes, "I never in my life lied to you. Mary is dying, and I could not let her go without giving you a chance to see her. Last night, in her delirium, she begged for you. She wants you, John. She wants to say good-bye to you." But my master remained unmoved. The sinister look in the eyes, the doggedness of the face did not change. He stared at them. Then he shouted in frenzy, "You lie! You want my money! Everybody wants it. Everybody loves it. There isn't an honest man in the world. All are thieves. All are lovers of gold. I know by your looks that you love it," he went on, "and you can't fool me by your tears and your preaching. You get out of this house," he suddenly shrieked, "or I will kill you, both of you." He swore a terrible oath and stepped back to seize the heavy bludgeon on the table. The woman cried out in fear and turned away weeping. But the parson stood his ground. "John Roberts," he said, "thou art a doomed man. The lust of gold that destroys so many is in thee strong and mighty, and only God can save thee, nor he against thy will. Repent, or thou shalt perish in a lonely place on a dark night, with none to help thee or hear thy cries. And all thy gold shall perish with thee." So saying, he turned and slowly left the house. For a moment my master stood glaring at the retreating forms of those who had come to him as friends, but whom he had treated as enemies. Then he rushed for the door and locked it. After that he lifted me tenderly upon the table, laughed softly, patted me with his hands, and stroked me caressingly. "My gold," he kept repeating, "my precious, precious gold." And as night came on, he poured out the gold and counted the glittering pieces. Again and again he counted his treasure until deep midnight had settled over all. But when he awoke in the morning he was very nervous. All day long he neither opened the door nor unbarred the shutters. All the while he kept muttering to himself as if planning some crafty plot. I could not know what all this might mean, but I caught enough of his talk to understand that he was more than ever suspicious of losing his money, was fearing all mankind more and more, and was trying to devise some scheme whereby he could find a place where no one could molest him or try to steal his gold. "They will get it yet," he kept saying, "unless I can go where no one can find me." Then he would curse his kind. At last, after hours of muttering and tramping back and forth in the darkened house, he suddenly seemed to find his decision. I shall never forget the terrible expression of evil triumph on his face as he paused before me and shouted, "I'll go where they can never find me. I want to be alone with my money, where I can spread it out and see it shine. I will go where there is not a man." After my master had said that, he made no further remarks, but he began with eager haste to pack a few things for his journey. He put me in a sack in which I could neither see nor hear what was happening, and that was all I knew for many a day. But all the while I felt myself being carried. One day I realized that I had been put in a boat. Then we went on and on, day after day. Finally the boat was stopped, and I was carried ashore. Then for the first time in many a long day I was taken from the bag. Again I saw the world about me. But how different were my surroundings from those of my old home! Where was I? I was on the very point of land off which you found me this evening. For the first few weeks of our stay on the shores of this lonely lake, things continued almost as they had been at home. The gold was my master's single thought. He seemed happy, almost joyous in the thought that he and I were at last out of the reach of men. Most of his time was spent looking at his gold. Every morning and every evening he would take me down to that point yonder where the sun shines clearly, and there would pour the treasure out in a great pile. He always did this exultingly, and his greatest pleasure was to play with the yellow coins, to count them over and over, and to laugh himself in a satisfied way. But after a time I could see that a change was coming over my master. He grew grave and quiet. No more, as he poured out his gold, did he chuckle and laugh to himself. All his movements seemed listless. He counted his money less frequently, and when he did so, it was in a half-hearted manner. One day I even saw him go away and leave the yellow heap lying on the sands. At last one day he came, packed the gold in me, put in my head with the greatest care. Moreover, when he went back to the camp, he left me there on the beach. I felt very strange and lonely, and the night seemed long indeed. At last the daybreak came, and glad I was to see it, but it was not until near sunset that my master came down to the point where I was. His face was as I had never seen it before. It was the countenance of a man who had suffered much and who was still suffering. He came to me, paused before me, and said, "For thee, thou cursed gold, I have wasted my life and ruined my soul." For some time he stood thus looking at me. Then he began to walk up and down the strip of beach, wringing his hands and beating his breast. "Oh, if I could only do it!" he kept saying. "If I could only do it! If I could, there might be hope, even for me. Lord, help me to do it. Lord, help me." After many hours of this, which I knew to be mental torment for my poor wretched master, when he was exhausted in body and in mind, he came back along the sands toward me. To my astonishment, he knelt down beside me. He placed his hands together. He lifted his face skyward. My master prayed. "Lord of the great world," he said, "come to my aid, or I am lost. In thy great mercy save me. Here, where no man may hear, hear thou my cry. Thou Lord of heavenly mercy, lend me thine aid." He paused, and over his face I seemed to see the dawning of a deep peace. He rose to his feet, lifted me, and bore me down to the boat. Then he slowly paddled away toward the center of the lake, repeating his prayer. At last he checked the boat. Then, having looked toward the sky, he said in a low, sweet voice, "Lord, thou hast given me grace and strength." At that he lifted me high above his head. There was a crash as if pieces of wood were falling together, and my eyes opened with a snap. My fire had smoldered down. The keg, heated by the fire, had tumbled inward, and lay there in a confused heap. "What a queer dream!" I said to myself. I was really beginning to believe that these things had happened. I rose to my feet and stepped down to the edge of the lonely water. I am not ashamed to say that my blood was chilled at what I saw. As I looked across the lake within 20 feet of where I had found the keg, there was a boat with a man sitting motionless in it. When that mysterious canoe appeared on the bosom of the lonely lake, I thought that I was looking upon a vision of a spectral nature. In spite of all my belief that I was alone on this remote beach, there sat the man in the boat, only a few rods offshore. He was a mirage, as silent as the very lake itself. A few eerie moments passed. Then the boat began to move slowly toward me, gently propelled by a skillful paddle. As it approached, the light of the full moon streaming upon it made it easy for me to study its occupants. Near the bow I could discern a hound crouching. In the stern sat the paddler, his rifle across his knees. "Hello! The camp there!" shouted the man in the boat. "Hello!" I called, glad enough to find that my strange visitor was no apparition. The canoe came ashore, I greeted the boatman, and together we walked up toward the camp, the hound following us in a leisurely fashion. There I replenished the fire. Then for a moment the stranger and I stood and looked at each other. He was over 6 feet in height, but so symmetrically proportioned in his physical stature that, great as it was, he was neither awkward nor ungainly. But for the fact that his eye had lost its earlier brightness and that his hair was sprinkled with threads of gray, it would have been impossible to believe that he had reached 80 years and 10, for his form was still erect, his step elastic, and his voice clear and strong. His features were regular and strong, giving proof of the man's self-reliant and indomitable character. Years, perhaps a lifetime of activity in the woods and on the lakes, had bronzed the man. From beneath heavy eyebrows looked eyes gray in color and baffling in depth. The man's whole appearance attracted me singularly. "Thank you for your welcome, mister," he began. "I shouldn't have dropped in on you at this unseemly hour, but the line of your smoke caught my eye as I was turning the point yonder. I didn't expect to find a human being on these shores. I ask your pardon for coming in on you, but I have memories of this spot that made me think strange things when I saw your camp. I am John Norton, the trapper. And who might you be, young man?" "I am Henry Herbert," I replied. "But just call me plain Henry." "Well, Henry," began the old trapper, "I am going to call you that. When men meet in the woods, they don't put on any airs. I have been in these woods 62 years, and they have been a home for me, for my father and mother are gone, and I have never had wife nor child of my own. And I have heard of you, Henry. You be no stranger to me. For 10 years back I've heard how you like to travel the woods and the waters by yourself, learning things that nature does not tell about in crowds. I have heard, too, that you be a good shot, and you know the ways of outwitting the trout and the pickerel. Hearing about you this way, I knew some day that I would come across your trail. But I never thought to run agin you tonight, for I'd no idea that mortal man knowed this lake save me and that other." The old man paused, seated himself on the end of a log, and gazed into the fire with a solemn look on his face. I did not feel like breaking in on his meditations, whatever they might be. I was silent out of deference to his memories. "This lake," John Norton said at length, "this lake is a strange place. I have been here for 11 years. No other place in all this wide country makes me feel as this place does." Again he fell into a reverie. I, meanwhile, busied myself with supper, and as soon as this was prepared, the two of us enjoyed it as only woodmen can. "If you know me," I said, "we are no strangers to each other, for I know you. Who draws the steadiest bead with a rifle? Who is the best boatman who ever feathered paddle? And who is honest a man as ever drew breath? Who but John Norton, whom I have always been wanting to meet? No man could be as welcome to my camp." "Well, well," laughed the old man, "when you're at home you must be one of them detective fellows. I see we aren't no strangers to each other, and if while in these woods old John Norton can teach you any trick of hunting or fishing or trapping, be sure he will do so for the welcome you have given him." So we sat on either side of the fire, silent for a few moments. Then the old trapper said, "I am thinking of the things that happened here long years agone. Strange things have come to pass on this very point. It is 11 year this very night that me and the hound slept here, and a solemn night it was, too. God of heaven, man, what is that?" The old man's startled ejaculation brought me to my feet as if a panther were upon me. Glancing at the spot he had indicated by look and gesture, I beheld only the shattered portion of the keg. Not knowing what to make of the trapper's excited action, I said, "That is only a keg I picked up in the lake this evening." John Norton rose in silence to his feet, and went over to where the staves lay. One of these he picked up and held contemplatively in his hand. "The ways of the Lord are past the knowing of mortals," he said. "But perhaps in the long run He brings the wrong to the right, and so makes the evil in the world to praise Him." "Henry," said the old trapper, looking keenly at me, "I have a mind to tell you the story of the man who owned that keg. A strange tale it be, but a true one, and the teaching of it be solemn." Eagerly I urged him to give me the story, a part of which, at least, I felt that I already knew. "It was 11 year agone in this very month that I came down to the inlet yonder into the lake. The moon was nigh her full, and everything looked solemn and white just as it do now. Lord knows I little thought to meet a man in these solitudes when I run agin what I'm telling you of. I was paddling down this side of the lake when I heard the strangest sounds I ever heard coming out of a bird or beast. You better believe, Henry, that I sot and listened until I was nothing but ears, but nary a thing could I make out of it. After a while I said I would try to ambush the creature and find out what mouth had a language that old John Norton couldn't understand. As I got nearer the shore, my boat just drifting in the moonlight, I heard a kind of crawling sound as if the brute was a-trailing himself on the ground. The shake of a bush give me the line on him, and I felt sure that in a minute I could let the lead drive where it ought to go. I had my rifle to my face, when by the Lord of mercy, Henry, I discovered I'd ambushed a man. And, Henry," he continued, "the words of the man was words of prayer. Never in my life was I taken so unawares or was so unbalanced as when I heard the voice of that man I had mistook for an animal break out in prayer. For a minute the blood stopped in my heart, and my hair moved in my scalp. Then I shook like a man with the chills. I had come that nigh to being a murderer, Henry. How that man prayed! He prayed for help as one calls to a comrade when his boat has gone down under him in the rapids, and he knows he must have help or die. This man's soul was struggling hard, I tell you. The words of his cry come out of his mouth like the words of one who is surely lost unless somebody saves him. It's dreadful for a man to live in such a way that he has to pray in that fashion, for we ought to live, Henry, so that it is cheerful like to meet the Lord, and pleasant to hold converse with him. I sot in my boat till his praying was done. Then I hugged myself close in under the bushes, for I heard him coming down toward the shore. And he did come, and come close to me, and in his arms he carried something very heavy. In a moment I heard him shove a boat out from the bushes. Then getting in, he pushed off into the lake. He held for the center of it, and when he had come nigh to the middle of it, he laid his paddle down and lifted something into the air. This he turned upside down, and outstreamed into the water something that glinted in the moonlight. After that he come paddling back for the shore. Myself, I kept shy of the man that night, but the next morning I went to the stranger's camp. There was nothing in sight but an old ragged tent sagging at every seam. I called aloud so that mayhap the man would answer me, but no answer came. I walked up to the tent and drew aside the rotten flap, and Henry, there laid a man senseless before me. I thought he was dead, and I uncovered my head. But the hound there knowed better, for he began to wag his tail. I went in, and found that the man was still breathing. I lifted him in my arms, Henry, and bore him out of the foul air of that tent, taking him down to the warm sunshine on the point. For a long while I thought he was going to die in my arms. He just lay there lifeless like, a-lookin' across the lake with eyes half shut. But the sun and the air revived him, and after a long while he stirs and says, "Old man, who are you who are so kind to me?" I tells him I was John Norton, the trapper. "I am John Roberts," he says, "and I haven't a friend on earth, nor do I deserve one. Old man, you cannot understand because you have lived an innocent life. But I am a sinner, a wretched sinner, and my moments here are numbered. I will tell you of my crimes. I will confess them, for they lie heavy on my heart. John Norton, I was a miser. I had a heart with a passion for gold. For the evil love of money, I turned my face away from my kind. My wife I deserted. My only child I refused with curses to see, even when she sent for me as she lay dying. John Norton, I gave all for gold. And the more I loved it, the more I hated man. With my dreadful lust there grew suspicion of every one. All ties of affection were severed. I lived alone, hoarding my gold and gloating over it. At last I fled from the habitations of men, bringing my gold, my God, with me in a keg. Here on this lonely shore I thought to be happy, far from my own kind, far from any danger that my precious treasure be stolen. But, John Norton, and a dying man is speaking, for all my counting of the bright gold on the sands here, and my dancing about it as a devil might, laughing and singing, I was unhappy. I knew that God was watching me and was disapproving. I could not but think of my wife and child. The thought of them began to make the gold hateful to me. Then, old man, I began to pray the Lord to deliver me. It was a bitter struggle I fought, but at length He rescued me. He gave me strength, John Norton, to overcome the wicked one. He gave me strength to break away from my sin. He gave me strength last night to pour every piece of gold that had been for me both love and life into the lake there. I shall never see it more, and I am happy." After that he lay silent-like, looking up at the blue sky. Then his eyes closed, and I thought him sleeping. But suddenly he started up. "A light! A light! I see a light!" Then, Henry, he sank back into my arms and spoke no more. I hope my passing may be as peaceful as his, and my face as calm as was his after his battle of life was over. The next day I buried him up yonder under them hemlocks, having no one to help me, but doing it respectful like, as all such should be done. There he lies, Henry, the man who was the owner of that keg, John Roberts, the miser who repented before it was too late. Nor do I doubt," he added in his kindly tone, "but he's been forgiven by those he wronged." End of chapter 12. Recording by David Gore. End of The Boy Scouts Book of Campfire Stories.